Hi, guys. Welcome to the second lecture on the Romantic Century. Um, we're just covering the second half of the 19th century now. The other lecture is mostly the first half of the 19th century. So everything that we talked about for the first half is still true. All those obsessions, death, storytelling, all that stuff are still true. There's going to be an emphasis in the later half of the 19th century on nationalism in Europe in general and even a little further east. And so there's a push towards unification of peoples that's new. Um, and so part of this nationalism is not only the language we speak, but also the stories we tell ourselves. Okay. And so people are digging up their mythologies. So, yeah, the Greek mythologies still come back to life, but now we're talking more than that. German mythologies and other mythologies of other nations across the continent. Um, what else is true of the 19th century besides the nationalism and these other obsessions we talked about before? There will be signs of things that we typically think of 20th century, although we may not say too much about them. We'll talk about symbolism today, actually, and then surrealism is probably it's a little hard to portray in music, but some other things like that, which is we tend to think of as more 20th century anyway. Um, this is the very end of the era of common practice or period of common practice. By the end of the 19th century, by the time we enter the 20th century, they're going to use up until the end of the 19th century. Major minor was the only way to go. Okay, but when we get into the 20th century, man, they break out a major minor. They break out a tonality, and we wind up with systems for doing all kinds of things, including total atonality. We have technology is influencing a little bit, but not enough for us to talk about too much this time. A huge part of the 19th century is that it's an aftershock of the French Revolution, and that means the affluent middle class, the bourgeois, have large effects. You can think of it really, if you want, as consumerism because that's really where it's starting. There are certain groups of composers who are content to stay within the confines of major minor, for example. And then there are a group of, what do we want to say, more radical composers who are trying hard to break out of this trap that they felt they were in by having to write tonal music, especially in the major minor system. Uh, the major minor system becomes way more complicated. Chromatic harmonies and nebulous tonality, but still, it's still tonal. But they're trying to make it not quite so obvious. And so, yeah, chromaticism, the harmonies get a lot more complicated. When we say chromaticism, literally it translates as color. Okay. And that means within the octave, we use all the notes, black and white notes. We could use all of them for harmonies if we wanted to, whereas before we were more restricted. Well, okay, let's talk about composers that are trying to create something new. And that is, first one is going to be Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner was not a very nice man, but he was a great composer, and he if I wanted to make him mad, I would say he was a great opera composer, but he would say no because he didn't like opera. He thought of opera as Italian opera, and there were just issues with it. It was melodramatic. The orchestra was just a giant guitar accompaniment, and he felt they should be more equal. Um, and so he would call them music dramas. Okay, and he had a whole philosophy about how music dramas, opera, should be done. And this is encompassed in his philosophy of Gesamtkunstwerk, which means total artwork. And now this is a word that still gets thrown out once in a while these days, having mostly to do with film, but of course they didn't have film yet then. And so total artwork means it's not just great singing, it should be equal partners, and they should all be the best. Singing, the orchestra should be great and have an equal part. We should have great sets, great costumes, great acting. all this should come together. And then if you have the best of all these things, when they come together, it's a synergistic effect and they become greater than the sum of the parts. Okay. And that's what this philosophy of Gesamtkunstwerk is really about. He had a couple of specific techniques that he wanted to that he used to create this, and one of them is the center of his musical composition, which is called the leitmotif system. If you will recall, Berlioz had his fixed idea where a theme represented his lover, and that was the lover in all five movements of his symphony there, the Symphonie Fantastique. But Wagner puts this idea on steroids. He said that every person, place, thing, or even an idea should have its own theme. And and when we hear this theme, it should be playing in the orchestra. Now, let me diverge for just a moment from that topic and talk about what he thought the orchestra should do philosophically. He thought that in a stage drama, much like real life, oftentimes the characters are not telling the truth. They're lying to each other. They're telling even just white lies, whatever. And so he felt, well, there should be something telling you the truth, and that should be the orchestra. Okay. Now go back to this leitmotif system, and this system has changed music forever, guys. Particularly if you watch movies at all or television. Wow, particularly movies though, because that means a person, place, thing, or idea. That means when we're talking about that person, place, thing, or idea, there's that theme is in the orchestra. When we're thinking about even just that person, place, thing, or idea, it should be in the orchestra. Okay, well, or even when they're on stage, of course, we're going to be playing it. It doesn't take long to figure out that, boy, that gets complicated in a hurry. And some people have done their entire dissertations on analysis of the various leitmotifs throughout Wagner's music dramas. And so, yeah, it's quite a fantastic system. And if you think you've never heard of this, you're wrong. I would refer you to Star Wars, Jaws, Harry Potter. Bum ba bum 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 bum. Yeah, you recognize that theme, or Star Wars. Yeah, you guys, those themes. You know that the Force in Star Wars has its own theme. Okay, and let's use for Anakin Skywalker as an example. When you first time you see Darth Vader in the original movies, for in the order that they were made, you hear this bum 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 ba bum bum ba bum. Okay, that is Darth Vader's theme, or the Grand March. Then, when he goes and does prequels, we get to the third prequel. Just Anakin is uh, trying to decide is he going to go to the dark side or the light side because the Emperor is going to save his wife, and while he's thinking about it on screen, what do we hear in the music? Bum 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 ba bum bum ba bum. The music is telling us that it's a done deal. Anakin's going bad. Okay, so this system is fantastic for helping to tell a story and can carry the story a lot of times when not much is happening visually. So yeah, if you've ever seen a Jaws movie, the bum 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 bum, that theme a lot of times carries the drama when nothing is happening on the screen. It's just a calm day out in the ocean, nothing happening, but you hear the da 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 da. You think, "Get out of there! It's a shark!" And then it goes away. Da, 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 da. So nothing happens on screen, but we know darn well that shark was nearby and then left. Ooh, yeah. So we're all tense about it because the music told us that. Okay, so another feature that he would do is, and when he despised the Italian opera about, is to cadence, to release the tension in the music when the drama doesn't call for it. We had a lot of Italian opera was still using regular four measure phrases, and they would cadence even though the drama was still carrying on just like it was. And he thought that was ridiculous. You shouldn't do that until the drama calls for it. So now what we have is a lot of elongated, long-lasting phrases, and sometimes in harmonies and stuff that do not resolve themselves, sometimes for a long, long time. So yeah, this is called endless melody. Okay. Well, all these things he combined to create to reinvent the form of opera, if you will, or music drama. And he even and built his own opera house to do this. Bayreuth. Okay. And Bayreuth is still running today, guys. It's so popular that if you want to buy tickets, you have to buy them 3 or 4 years in advance. So and actually, it's still run by members of his family, thanks to his wife who ran it after he died. So anyway, that's Wagner. This kind of changed music forever, guys. We're still using the heck out of this system, and so that's Richard Wagner. He was born in 1813. Now I'm going to bring that up later on because he's the same year that another very famous opera composer was born. The most famous compositions by Wagner would be Das Ring des Nibelungen. It's the Ring Cycle. And, we talk about swords and magic rings and stuff like that, swords with names. Sounds awful similar to Tolkien. Well, yeah, it's because, remember I talk about the peoples digging up their own mythologies. Tolkien and Wagner used the same source materials for this, okay? And it's the tales of the Nibelungen, okay? And so while they use them differently in telling their stories, nevertheless, the elements are the same because they use the same source materials. Okay. Um, Das Ring des Nibelungen is four music dramas in succession. So think of them as sequels and prequels and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's exactly what they are. And they're long, guys. Depending on who's conducting, anywhere from 20 to maybe even 24 hours long, without breaks. Okay. But of course, these days they do put breaks in. Originally, Wagner didn't allow intermissions, and these operas are 4 or 5 hours long. Whoa! Talk about merciless, huh? Well, all right. Wagner was not a particularly nice man. He was a racist and a bigot, and he owed people lots of money and everything else. But he could compose, and so he influenced music really, at least so far, for at least another century and more, because we're in the 21st century now. So that brings us to another composer. Oh, wait a minute. Did I leave something in here? Let me think here. No, that's fine. Um, now, opera, or in Wagner's case, music dramas, hugely popular. All right, all the way through the centuries, but particularly towards the end, as opera starts to change, Wagner is introducing his whole system, and even an Italian opera was starting to change. And eventually, we get to perhaps the most famous opera composer of all time, Giuseppe Verdi. Or if you want to just call him Joe Green, well, don't do that because we won't know who you're talking about. That's the English, though. So Giuseppe Verdi, born in 1813, same year as Wagner, which is so funny because Verdi and Wagner, as far as we know, they never met, but they used to trade barbs in the newspaper and stuff like that. Think of it as being on the internet today. And Wagner was an ardent German nationalist. Verdi was a pretty ardent Italian nationalist. And these are the two success stories during this century for unification, guys. The Germans unify for the first time ever by the end of this century. The Italians unify for the first time since the end of the Roman Empire. So we're talking 1500 years, okay? So, yeah, but Giuseppe Verdi was very much for pro Italian nationalism. At this point, it was occupied by several other countries, and there were city states. There's the papal states, so there were like 5 or 6 different regions that were differently occupied by different people. And so there was this drive towards unification of Italians, and they eventually do succeed. Verdi did not use the leitmotif system, though I will say his orchestras do become much more important in terms of telling the story. And certainly, all these things, the orchestras are getting bigger and more dramatic and all this kind of stuff. They're adding instruments and all this kind of stuff. He wrote 26 operas, all of which are still performed, and most of them all the time. I mean, there's a couple that aren't done so often. He really only had one true failure, and that was an opera that he had. It was supposed to be a comedy that he had to write just after his family died. So yeah, kind of hard to write a comedy. But otherwise, they've all been huge success, and this was early on in his career. So he was very depressed about it, of course. So from there on out, he promised he was going to No more funny comedies or like that. He wrote serious operas, tragic operas, clear to the end of, and of course everybody dies in them. And this was Verdi clear to the very end, except for his very last opera, Falstaff, which is based on the Merry Wives of Windsor. And so that when he wrote when he was in his late 70s was a comedy as well. So he wrote two comedies. The first one was a failure. It is still done occasionally. But all his other operas, they're done all the time. Okay. And being a true Italian, guys, part of the appeal is, boy, there's some great tunes in this. La donna mobile, quai più m'avento. That's one very famous tune. There's others. Like a true Italian musician, man, they just love writing tunes that are singable. And he did, and they are. And they're gorgeous. If you start singing a Verdi opera on the street, the Italians would join in because opera is very much like folk music to them. Um, let's see, what else should we say about this? Okay, let's before most of. Oh, well, okay. I told you that Verdi was a Italian nationalist. He even lent his name to it. After his operas would be performed, you could often see painted on the wall, "Viva Verdi," hooray for Verdi, right? Except that this was an acronym, Viva Emanuele Re d'Italia. Now, Emmanuel was the king of Tuscany during this time, and what they wanted to do was unite all of Italy under the reign of Emmanuel. They eventually succeeded in doing this. I mean, it only lasted 10 years or so, but they do unify. And the Italians have been a unified country pretty much ever since. And so he knew they were doing this. Viva, V-E-R-D-I, Viva Emmanuel, Re, R-D-D, Italia. Italia. So, and this was like uh, unity is basically what he's professing here. I don't know if he ever did it himself, but he knew people were doing it in his name, and he was fine with that. Probably the most famous operas that you're going to see done everywhere are La Traviata, Rigoletto, Aida, Falstaff, and Otello. Okay, well, all right. So this is probably the most frequently performed composer, opera composer ever. Okay. Now, the next guy we're going to talk about is Johannes Brahms. Brahms is something different. Almost everyone wanted to be an opera composer because that's what everybody loved. That's what everybody talked about. That's that was everybody's doing it, right? But Brahms was an exception to this. He never wrote an opera. Okay, some people just don't really have a feel for it. Beethoven did write an opera, one, but he struggled and struggled and struggled. And some people would argue that I mean, it's done all the time, yes. And not to say it's a bad opera, it's not, but he doesn't have the same feel for it that others do. Okay, some people just have a feel for the drama, and Johannes Brahms didn't even try. Okay, he's considered a conservative of the time, and also because he used a lot of times very obvious classical forms like sonata allegro form and these other things we talked about. Because he was a little stuffy this way, he had a hard time getting his career started. But he can be give thanks to his career, probably to a large extent, to the Schumanns, Robert Schumann and Clara Schumann. Remember, they wrote that in that magazine, the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, and a criticism of new music. And what they would do is help young composers by putting their music in the magazine and maybe even help with cash sometimes. And they did this with Brahms. And eventually Brahms does get a career going. He's hugely successful, but it took a little bit of help. We know that Johannes Brahms, after Robert Schumann died, confessed to Clara that he was madly in love with her, wanted her to marry him, but she kept saying no. We don't know. We know that he loved her. I'm not. It's not quite as clear how much she felt about him. But many people speculate that she didn't want to give up writing and performing for the magazine, which if she got married, she was afraid she might have to. So anyway, they never got together, at least not officially in that capacity. So Brahms he never wrote an opera, but lots of really good dramatic. You wouldn't confuse his music for classical music though, because yeah, he used classical forms and stuff, but he used romantic harmonies, real thick chords, and there was a lot of emotion and drama in it. and romantic rhythms and stuff that they wouldn't have used necessarily in the classical period so obviously. So at any rate, he's a romantic, but just on the conservative side is all. Okay, now there are some other. It's like, how do you go about writing nationalistic music? All these composers, nearly all of them, would be considered nationalistic. Why is that? And how do you write nationalistic music? Well, okay, the easy way to write a nationalistic piece of music is add folk songs or folk dances that elicit the images of a region somewhere in the world. Okay. Now there's a more subtle layer that you can pick up on if you pay attention, and that is language. Now, yeah, you can write a symphony; it doesn't have any singing necessarily, but what you might be able to pick up on is if you look at the native language of the composer, the language, because every language not only has its own melody, every language has its own rhythm as well, characteristic rhythms, let's call this. And so when you write the music, they tend to write these rhythms into their music, which is another more subtle layer of adding nationality to or nationalism to a piece of music. Eventually, of course, they probably use up most of the tunes they want to use in an area. So then, what happens if you start using a folk tune, but it's not from where you were born? Well, okay, now we have to call it exoticism because you weren't born there. Yeah, it could be a folk song, a folk dance. Now, the thing is with exoticism, you're probably, because you're not from there, don't speak the language natively, you're probably not going to use those rhythms of the native of that area. So that's a subtlety that we're missing in exoticism. But otherwise, it's the same process, right? A tune maybe that evokes an image of a region somewhere in the world. We had nationalists all over the place, even including as far east as Russia. Uh, we have Grieg, Rimsky-Korsakov, Borodin, Mussorgsky, Balakirev. These are all considered pretty much nationalistic Russian composers. They were focused on writing music that sounded particularly Russian. We would have to say that Tchaikovsky generally is not included in that. He did use Russian folk songs in his pieces a lot of times. Interestingly enough, though, he's a very thoroughly trained German style symphonist, and so those rhythms we were talking about and stuff, they don't show up so much. Also, they just picked on him probably because they could, and he was quite successful. These guys, maybe not quite so much as him, and maybe there was some jealousy involved too, and some other issues. But anyway, as far as Americas go, nationalism was late to get a start here. There were good American composers, but everybody sounded like Germans. Now, as you might guess, German symphonists, the German romantic approach to music, was dominating everything. So think, Wagner, Beethoven, Brahms, all these Germans, and so people were trying to figure out a way to break out from this. Okay, and so the Americans were late to call. We have to wait till the 20th century, really, to really see music that's written with nationalistic type music that we might consider nationalistic. Okay, again, folk songs, folk dances, and maybe those rhythms. I don't know. So we have to wait a while for the Americans to show up on the scene. Now, part of one of the people that helped Americans find their way is a European, actually a Bohemian. Now, Bohemia was one of those countries that was trying to unify at the time, and they failed. Okay, so when we say someone leads a Bohemian lifestyle, it's because the Bohemians did not have a homeland at the time. This would be modern day Czech Republic. Okay, and so a lot of Bohemians travel all over the place. Well, there was one Bohemian who came to America to help Americans, ironically enough, find a nationalistic voice eventually. And this guy was called Antonin Dvorak. He came here as a conductor, composer, and he thought, what, you guys, you're missing the boat. There are a number of sources that you can use for American nationalistic music as well. He named three primary sources. One, Appalachian folk music from the Appalachians sounds remarkably Scottish. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Now, the reason that can be played with the bagpipes so easily is because, of course, that was influencing the music of the Appalachians of the time. This was a huge influence on American music. But even two just as obvious sources about slave spirituals. Wow, they're hugely popular, guys. They still are. And so he said, hey, this is something that we only hear in America. You could use these tunes. And then, of course, another one that maybe seems just as obvious is Native American tunes. He wrote a number of pieces that seem to pick up on these different styles that could be included, or sources, I guess. He has the New World Symphony, the New World being the Americas, of course, the American String Quartet. So he's got these compositions that seem to show these influences. Here's an example, though, guys. Now, I don't speak Czech, but I have been told that the Czech language has a strong emphasis on first syllables. So rhythmically, da 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 da. And with Dvorak, you hear this in his music all the time. So he's in America writing his music about American native sources. And is this nationalistic? Is it exoticism? Well, I don't know. I think it sounds like I mean, I'm not the only one that thinks it probably sounds like a Czech composer trying to sound like an American or maybe even a German, because he's a German symphonist. That's how he was trained, much like Tchaikovsky. So I don't know, but at any rate, he certainly helped point the way and made people aware that these sources were there, in a more obvious sense. Um, and then some people will pick up on it eventually. We'll talk about Aaron Copland, especially. Um, okay, I'm going to name one more composer, although this does bleed into the 20th century a little bit. Well, quite a bit actually, and that is Richard Strauss. Now, Richard Strauss is a total romantic. Okay, the harmonies and everything. The major minor system is stretched to its maximum, so the tonality sometimes is a little ambiguous, but it is still tonal, and these rich romantic harmonies. He again is one that considered himself an opera composer. Um, that was what he called himself, like Mozart did. Mozart called himself an opera composer. Okay, and he only wrote one symphony that I'm aware of. That's the Alpine Symphony. So what he really wanted to be considered was an opera composer. Now, what we remember him probably the most famously for are these tone poems. Now, remember, we gave Liszt credit for creating a tone poem, a single movement form for an orchestra to perform in concert without singers or voices or anything like that. Okay, that tells a story. Okay, that's a tone poem, and so this he wrote a number of tone poems. But what's the most famous one? Ba da 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 da. Also sprach Zarathustra. Thus spoke Zarathustra, which is a tone poem about creation, basically, and it's Genesis essentially. Although this Genesis, even in the Christian Bible and in the other books that were religions of the faith, they really need to give credit to Zoroastrianism, which was in existence before these other religions, and the Genesis story is virtually identical. That's where they got it, actually. And so the whole idea that there was nothing and then there was light and it was good and all this kind of stuff. This is Zoroastrianism, I should say. That's the appropriate word. So Zarathustra is a variation on the name Zoroastro, Zarathustra, and so Zoroastrianism was the religion that dominated the Middle East for a long time. It is still around, although of course it doesn't dominate anymore. You mostly find it in Iran. I last time I checked, they figured there was 200,000 or 300,000 of them still in practice. So anyway, thus spoke Zarathustra as a statement of Genesis. Boom, creation, right? And okay, Strauss didn't die until 1949, so yeah, we're in the 20th century. Is this Romanticism or is it neo-Romanticism? I don't know. Either one probably works because you can argue that he uses 20th century harmonies and rhythms, which he does. So maybe it's neo-romantic. But at any rate, that's where I'm going to leave off. And next lecture will be on the 20th century.